When David was told, "Look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors," he inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord answered him, "Go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Here in Judah we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces?" So they don't think they can do this. They're already scattered and afraid enough here in Judah, let alone taking on an enemy force. Once again David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, "Go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hand." Now, before we go on here, I want us to remember that in the original version, the original writing of this language, the original text didn't have line breaks and section breaks and chapter breaks and punctuation like periods and quotation marks and commas. Okay, so when we read this section, we see a bunch of quotation marks as if they're talking back and forth. I'm not sure if that's accurate. Okay, that gets added in by some translator later on, but that's not in the original text. And I think that this is an example of it doesn't say so. The text doesn't say so specifically. But I think this is an example of David, because he has a priest with him now, Abiathar. I think this is an example of David inquiring of the Lord by consulting the and the Thummim. Remember those weird rocks that apparently communicated an answer from God if you asked him a question, either in yes or no fashion, either or. So I think David is asking these rocks, shall he go and attack the Philistines? And the answer he's getting from them somehow is yes, go. I don't think this is an actual conversation that he's having with God, so there really shouldn't be quotation marks here. Once again, okay, I saw that already. So he says go. The second answer is go. God will give the Philistines into David's hand. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. Now Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. So there's, I think, a reference. Because the ephod, they kept the and the Thummim in these pockets somehow, that were sewn into the ephod. So my guess is that Abiathar has it, and he has the and the Thummim, and that is how they're consulting of the Lord here. The Philistines, trying to understand their motivation here, the Philistines were a seafaring people who had come to this land from the Mediterranean Sea somewhere, and they wanted to, they wanted to establish trade routes farther into the mainland here, farther east and north of Israel, so they could sell their goods to the peoples beyond Israel. They're not necessarily seeking to conquer Israel for the sake of just conquering Israel. They're not necessarily seeking to build a nation or an empire here in the way that later generations of rulers will. We're not really in the nation or empire building phase of history yet. That's going to come along a little bit later. The Philistines are not really after land in the sense that they want to build a nation or an empire. What they want to do is secure trade routes through Israel and beyond, so that they can sell their goods, which they're bringing from overseas, for money. That's what they want to do. That's their primary motivation. They're fighting the Israelites to gain access to these trade routes, so they're not really trying to control the land or enslave the Israelites the way that later enemies will, per se. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, "God has handed him over to me, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars." That's how a despot thinks. That's how a crazy tyrant thinks. Even though he's been told that God has rejected him, he thinks that he's been told that God has replaced him with somebody already. Now, he doesn't know exactly that it's David yet. But he hasn't been specifically told it's David yet, but he knows it's somebody. And he is so crazy in his own paranoia and delusion that he thinks God now has handed David over to him by doing this. Again, that's a very Donald Trump way of thinking. A very Donald Trump way of thinking. And Saul called up all his forces for battle to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod." David said, "O Lord," now he's definitely talking to the Urim and the Thummim here. It doesn't say that. He's talking to the ephod, but inside the ephod are the Urim and the Thummim. So he is definitely talking to the Urim and the Thummim here. "O Lord, God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, God of Israel, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will." Again David asked, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will." So David and his men, about 600 in number, so originally it was 400, now it's 600. He's gained a couple hundred followers since then, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he did not go there. So these people were saved by David, that they were willing to hand him over to Saul because they did not want Saul to massacre them like he massacred the priests at Nob. If he massacred the priests at Nob, he'll massacre a town of just regular people. Okay? If Saul had no problems ordering his men, and at least one of his men had no problems following his order, to massacre the priests, the entire priestly town, he's not going to have any problems ordering the massacre of just some other regular town. So they don't want any part of that. Even though David saved them, they don't want any part of the consequences of Saul coming after them. And when Saul was told that David had moved on from Keilah, he just didn't go there. He's not going to wage war against his own people. Even Saul isn't quite that crazy. David stayed in the desert strong-hills and in the hills of the... Hey, you know what? Let me start a new video. No, let's go on. Let's go on. Yeah, let's start a new video.